On July 4, 2026, a sheriff with 36 years on the job stood in front of a room full of cameras and said something that made every hour of the previous 4 days feel like it had happened for a different reason than anyone believed at the time. A 4-year-old girl, reported missing from her own backyard, was not missing anymore. She was dead, and she had been dead, investigators now believed, for roughly a month before her own mother ever dialed 911. Sit with that for a second, because the entire case turns on it. Not on whether something terrible happened to Javeayah Harris, on when it happened, and on who was still calling her missing weeks after the evidence suggests she was already gone. This is the story of a search that mobilized more than 200 people. A 9-day-old newborn born the same night his sister was reported missing, and 2 parents now sitting in the Aiken County Detention Center charged with her death. What follows is built entirely from official statements, court charges, police records, and on-camera interviews. Nothing here is invented. Where something is still unproven, we're going to say so plainly, because these 2 people have been charged, not convicted, and that distinction matters more in this case than almost any other we've covered. Before we go further, if you want to be here when this case reaches a courtroom, take a second and hit subscribe, and tap that like button now. We follow cases like this one from the first headline all the way to the verdict, and we'd rather you not miss the parts that matter most. Now back to Hillsborough Street. It's an ordinary stretch of Aiken, South Carolina. Modest homes, long yards, the kind of neighborhood where people still recognize each other's cars. Javeayah Harris was 4 years old, 3.5 feet tall, 42 pounds. She liked Minnie Mouse. She wore her hair in pink beads. Neighbors who spoke to local news described her the same way, almost word for word. Bright, chatty, unusually polite for her age. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. Yes, sir. No, sir. That was apparently just how she talked to adults, without exception. Her parents, 23-year-old Johmarea Harris and 22-year-old Michilae Herring, lived with her in a house near Hillsborough Street and Ridgecrest Road. Young parents. The kind of couple a neighbor might wave to without a second thought. The kind of family nobody expects to end up on the evening news. It's worth pausing on Javeayah herself before this story turns toward investigators, statutes, and charges, because it's easy for a case like this to become so procedural that the child at the center of it gets reduced to a set of facts in a police report. She wasn't that. By every account given to reporters, she was a specific, particular little girl. One who liked chasing the family's chickens around the yard, who had opinions about her hair, who greeted grown strangers with the kind of formal politeness some 4-year-olds haven't learned yet and others never lose. Neighbors who barely knew her described her anyway, because apparently she was hard not to notice in a small, ordinary way. The kid on the block who said good morning to people twice her height without being told to. On the evening of June 30th, at around 8:15 p.m., that ordinary street became the center of a multi-agency search. According to the account the parents gave investigators, Javeayah had been playing outside near the family's chickens, wearing a pink Disney shirt, shorts, her Crocs, the beads in her hair. Her mother said this was the last time she saw her daughter. Her father said he'd been out running errands, gone for roughly an hour and a half, and returned home around 9 p.m. Somewhere in the space between those 2 accounts, according to what the parents told police, Javeayah disappeared. That's the story the public was given. Now here's what the public wasn't told yet. While search teams were still being organized that first night, investigators had already opened something running in parallel to the visible search. An inquiry into the household itself, not just the yard, not just the woods. We'll come back to why that matters. First, the search the world actually saw. Within hours, this stopped being a local matter. The Aiken County Sheriff's Office brought in the FBI and South Carolina's State Law Enforcement Division, SLED. Special Agent in Charge Kevin Moore later confirmed the response included the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit and its Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team, specialists brought in specifically for cases involving young children. Search and rescue crews worked with 9 units, helicopters, and drones, covering more than 3,000 acres by day 3 and eventually more than 5,000 before the operation wound down. Bethel Baptist Church became the staging ground, opening before sunrise every morning of the search, supplying food, water, and air conditioning for crews working through South Carolina heat. A local billboard company donated advertising space across the county to keep Javeayah's photo in front of as many people as possible. Deputies ran roadblocks near the search zone, stopping and searching vehicles, chasing down every tip that came in, some nights not clearing out until well after dark. For 4 days, this looked exactly like what everyone feared and hoped wasn't true at once. A race against time to bring a little girl home alive. Think about what that kind of search actually asks of the people doing it. 200 officers, agents, and volunteers moving through South Carolina heat in July, checking sheds, crawl spaces, drainage ditches, anywhere a small child could end up, alive or otherwise, though nobody was saying that second part out loud yet. Every one of those searchers was doing that work believing, or at least hoping, that the outcome at the end of it might be a little girl found alive and scared but breathing. That's not just physically exhausting work. It's psychological weight that doesn't show up in any after-action report. What does it do to 200 people to spend 4 days inside that hope, only to learn afterward that the search may have been built on a false premise from its very first hour? That's not a question this case can answer for the people who lived it, but it's worth carrying forward because it's part of what makes the sheriff's July 4th announcement land the way it did. Local businesses and residents who weren't part of any official search team pitched in wherever they could. People brought water to roadblocks. Some opened their properties to be checked without being asked. Digital billboards donated by the outdoor advertising company kept Javeayah's photo in front of drivers across the county around the clock. None of that changes what investigators would eventually conclude, but it's part of the record too, a community that, by every visible measure, believed it was searching for a living child, right up until it was told otherwise. Now here's the part that was happening at the same time, out of view. As reporters canvassed the neighborhood block by block, a pattern started emerging in what residents were telling them. Not about the night Javeayah was reported missing, but about the weeks before it. Multiple neighbors said they hadn't seen her in months. Not weeks, months. One resident who'd lived in the area for years put it plainly on camera. Everybody in that neighborhood knew everybody's kids. People were out on that street constantly. And for a little girl who supposedly lived right around the corner to go unseen for that long, somebody would have noticed her walking by. If that account holds up, then the premise the entire search was built on, a child last seen playing in her yard on a Tuesday evening, was already sitting on ground that wasn't solid. And once you know that, everything about those first hours needs a second look. Another resident described being woken up in the middle of the night by deputies going door to door, and admitted that even with how close the search was to her own home, part of her still couldn't fully process that a child could vanish from a street she'd lived on for years without anyone noticing something was wrong sooner. That's a common thread in cases like this one. Not suspicion exactly at first, more a kind of quiet disbelief that spreads through an entire block once a search like this lands on it, as people start replaying the last few weeks in their own heads, trying to place the last time they actually saw the child in question. For a lot of people on that street, by their own admission, the honest answer was that they couldn't. There's also a detail Javeayah Harris raised himself, unprompted, in his interview with police. He told investigators there had been people snooping around the property in the days before Javeayah was reported missing. People on the phone, walking slowly past the house, behavior he said he'd noticed and flagged before that Tuesday. Whether that detail points to something real, or whether it's the kind of thing a person reaches for when they sense the ground shifting under their own account, isn't something this case has settled. It's part of the record. We're including it for the same reason we're including everything else here. Not because it proves anything, but because leaving it out would be its own kind of distortion. There's a detail worth pausing on here, because it cuts both ways and neither reading cancels the other out. When investigators asked Johmarea Harris directly whether Javeayah was known to wander off, he said no, firmly. He said she wasn't a runner, but she was friendly to a fault, the kind of child who hadn't learned stranger danger the way parents usually try to teach it. He described her as verbal, sharp, well-spoken for her age. Then, unprompted, he brought up something that had clearly upset him. Early media coverage had described her as possibly nonverbal, possibly autistic. He disputed that outright, saying they'd never had her formally evaluated, but that she showed no signs of it. that she talked, in his words, better than he did. That's a strange thing to be bothered by if part of you already suspects the search itself won't find anyone. It's also exactly the kind of detail a person clinging to a story they've decided to tell might raise, because getting the small facts right is how a larger account holds together. Both readings are plausible. Neither one settles anything on its own. We're only telling you it happened because it's part of the public record, not because it points anywhere definitive. At some point during the investigation, Javeayah Harris sat for an interview and walked through his version of June 30th. It's worth understanding on its own terms because it's genuinely difficult to follow as a straight line. He described watching Javeayah play outside early that morning, then leaving the house sometime between 6 and 7. From there, his account loops on itself. He says he visited 3 different stores, returned to a laundromat next to a gas station, went out again, came back again, bought drinks while waiting on laundry, and noticed a heavy police presence near the store without connecting it to his own house. He said his girlfriend at the time, Michilae, couldn't reach him because her phone had no service, so she called 911 herself. By the time he turned onto his street and saw a police truck with a drone overhead, he said he sped up, assuming something had happened nearby. When he arrived and saw the number of officers at his home, his first assumption, he said, was that Michilae had gone into labor. She was due any day. It wasn't until he got out of the car that he learned his daughter was the reason for all of it. There's one detail in that account that's easy to miss on a first pass. Michilae did go into labor that same night after Javeayah had already been reported missing and gave birth hours later. In the middle of the same 911 call, the same descending response of officers and drones that was searching for her daughter. Here's the honest question worth sitting with instead of rushing past it. Is a looping, hard-to-follow timeline what shock sounds like? People in acute crisis genuinely do lose their grip on sequence. Trauma doesn't organize memory the way a police report does, and that's documented, and it happens to people who are completely innocent. But investigators are also trained to notice exactly this kind of thing for a different reason. Not grief, but a story rehearsed enough times that the seams start to show under repetition without being rehearsed enough to stay airtight. Both are real possibilities here. Neither is proof by itself. What can be said factually is that from early in the investigation, Javeayah Harris's own account of that day was one of the first things that didn't sit easily with the people reviewing it. While the visible search kept running at full intensity, helicopters, drones, roadblocks, hundreds of volunteers, a quieter operation was accelerating behind it. Interviews were being conducted, records were being pulled, neighbors were being reapproached, sometimes more than once, as investigators cross-checked one account against another. A local private investigator, unconnected to the case, observed to reporters during the search that even as the visible footprint seemed to shrink day over day, the investigation itself hadn't slowed at all. At a press conference partway through the search, Sheriff Marty Sawyer mentioned, almost in passing, that alongside the public search there was another team working the case from a different angle, off-site. At the time, it barely registered. In hindsight, it tells you something about what investigators were already considering possible, long before they said so out loud. A missing 4-year-old typically produces one kind of response in its earliest hours: search and rescue, canvassing, tip lines. What Sawyer was describing was something running in parallel almost from the start. A team not looking for a lost child in the woods, but looking closely at the people who lived with her. When a reporter later pressed Sawyer on exactly when the case shifted from a missing person search to a homicide investigation, his answer was deliberately careful. He said he didn't want to get ahead of the evidence, and that the FBI had been brought in early precisely so investigators wouldn't be playing catch-up if the case turned into something worse than a child who'd simply wandered off. He wouldn't give an exact date. What he did say was that once the off-site team determined Javeayah was, in his words, not there anymore, the purpose of the visible search changed, even though its footprint on the ground didn't shrink right away. Not there anymore is a strange way to describe a child who, if her parents' account were accurate, should never have been anywhere except her own backyard to begin with. The moment investigators started speaking about her that way is the moment this stopped being a search for a missing child and quietly became something else, even before the public was told in plain language. There's also a piece of history that surfaced only after the search had already begun. Javeayah's family previously lived in Union County and later in Clinton, South Carolina. Clinton's police chief, Michael Addison, confirmed that officers had responded to the family's apartment back on November 30th, 2025, for a verbal dispute between Javeayah Harris and Michilae Herring. According to the incident report from that call, the argument centered on Harris moving out of the residence. Herring told officers a restraining order was in place and that he shouldn't be near her, while Harris said the disagreement had started the day before over something as small as moving a table. Officers noted no visible injuries and classified the incident as non-criminal. As of the most recent reporting, Clinton police confirmed they had not been contacted to assist in the search for Javeayah's remains, though the department said it would cooperate if any evidence connected to that earlier incident became relevant. We're including that detail because it's part of the documented record, not because it proves anything about what happened 7 months later. A single non-criminal domestic dispute call is not evidence of child abuse. It's context. What a jury eventually does with context like this, if it's introduced at all, isn't something anyone outside that courtroom gets to decide in advance. On the morning of July 4th, Sheriff Sawyer stood at the podium and delivered what he called the hardest announcement of his career. The investigation and the evidence, he said, now led them to believe Javeayah Harris was deceased, not missing, not still out there. Gone. And gone, he said, for roughly a month before the 911 call was ever placed. He put it as directly as a sentence like that can be put. By the time that call came in on June 30th, it was already too late to save her. That statement carries its own weight without any need to add commentary to it. A sheriff with 36 years on the job telling a community that the search they had poured 4 days and thousands of acres into was, from its very first hour, a search for a body rather than a living child. Sawyer said the search would continue, now focused on an area of interest outside Aiken County that he declined to name publicly. FBI Special Agent Kevin Moore followed him at the podium and told reporters the investigation was now about pursuing justice for Javeayah. When asked how investigators had arrived at the 1-month estimate, Moore declined to answer. Some details, even at the hardest point in a case, stay in the file. That same day, both parents were arrested. Javeayah Harris was charged with homicide by child abuse. Michilae Herring was charged with the same offense, plus an additional count of filing a false police report. Both were booked into the Aiken County Detention Center. The sheriff's office said additional charges were still possible as the investigation continued, and a later hearing resulted in bond being denied for both parents. It's worth understanding exactly what homicide by child abuse means under South Carolina law, because it is not the same as a standard murder charge, and the difference shapes everything a jury will eventually be asked to weigh. Under the statute, a person is guilty of the offense if they cause a child's death while committing abuse or neglect, and that death occurs under circumstances showing extreme indifference to human life, or if they knowingly help someone else commit abuse or neglect that results in a child's death. Neglect under the same law includes failing to provide adequate food, shelter, or medical care, where that failure leads to a fatal injury, and it includes abandonment resulting in death. The offense carries a mandatory minimum of 20 years and can carry a life sentence. What that means practically is that prosecutors don't necessarily have to prove one deliberate act on one specific date the way a traditional murder charge would require. They can build a case around a sustained pattern, neglect or indifference over time that ultimately proved fatal. That opens the door to a different category of evidence than a single incident homicide would: behavior patterns inside the household, any prior injuries, statements from people who spent time around the family, and eventually, forensic evidence about the condition in which Javeayah's remains are found, whenever that happens. None of that has been tested in a courtroom yet. South Carolina law is also explicit that a child's crying cannot be treated as provocation or a mitigating factor under this statute, a clause written into the law specifically because of how often that exact excuse has been raised in cases like it. As of this recording, Javeayah's body has still not been recovered. That single fact means even the 1-month estimate investigators laid out is itself something a future trial will have to establish with evidence, not something already settled beyond argument. These are charges, not a verdict. No evidence has been tested in front of a jury. and no judge has ruled on guilt. It's also worth walking through what typically happens procedurally from here, because it's a stretch of the process that rarely gets covered once the cameras move on to the next story. Both parents will go through a preliminary hearing, where a judge determines whether prosecutors have enough to proceed to a grand jury. Bond has already been denied for both Harris and Herring, which in South Carolina generally reflects a judge's finding that the charges are serious enough or the evidence substantial enough at this stage to justify continued detention pending trial. If a grand jury returns an indictment, the case moves toward trial, a process that in cases involving a missing body and forensic uncertainty can realistically take well over a year, sometimes several, before a jury is ever seated. Recovery of Javeayah's remains, if and when it happens, would almost certainly become central to establishing the actual timeline and cause of death. The two pieces of evidence a case like this needs most, and currently doesn't have in public view. That leaves a question sitting at the center of this entire case, and it's worth naming honestly, instead of reaching for whichever version makes the cleaner story. What does it take for two parents to call 911, cry on camera, hand investigators a detailed description of their daughter's clothing, down to the beads in her hair, and stand at the center of a search spanning thousands of acres, if part of what's now alleged is that they already knew she wasn't going to be found? There are really only two shapes that question can take. One possibility is that grief and denial can produce behavior that looks, from the outside, indistinguishable from performance. That some part of a person hasn't caught up to what another part already knows, and the search itself becomes a way of not facing it yet. The other possibility is closer to what the charges themselves imply, that the search was a deliberate piece of cover, a way to redirect attention outward onto a community and a search area instead of a household. Nothing in the public record settles which of those it is. That's what the trial is for. It's worth noting how different this case looks from the way these stories usually unfold on this channel. Most of the cases we cover involve a body found relatively quickly, or a suspect who emerges only after months or years of a cold trail. This one inverted that. The suspects, if the charges hold, were never really strangers to investigators. They were the two people who called it in. And the search itself, the most public, most resource-intensive part of the entire case, may end up being remembered less as an effort to find Javeayah, and more as 4 days during which investigators quietly built the case that led to July 4th. That's an uncomfortable thing to sit with, because it means the volunteers who spent those 4 days searching, the church that opened its doors before sunrise, the drivers who saw her photo on a billboard and called in tips. None of them were told, and by the sheriff's own account, may not have needed to be told, what the parallel investigation had already started to suspect. That doesn't make their effort meaningless. It means the case they were searching inside of was more complicated from the very first hour than almost anyone outside the sheriff's office understood at the time. There's a practical detail worth sitting with too, one that doesn't get discussed as often as it should. A charge of filing a false police report exists specifically for situations where someone reports something they know isn't true. Whatever a jury eventually decides about the homicide charge, that second count against Michilae Herring is, by definition, an allegation that the original 911 call itself was not what it appeared to be on its surface. That's a materially different claim than simply failing to report a death in time. It's an allegation that some form of deception was present from the very first sentence of that call. And that raises the question this case will likely turn on more than almost any other piece of evidence. What actually happened inside that house in the weeks between whenever Javeayah died and the night that call was finally placed? Neither parent has offered a public account of that period, and neither is required to before trial. But it's the gap sitting underneath everything else. The 4 days of searching, the thousands of acres, the billboards, the roadblocks, all of it built on top of a stretch of time that, as of now, remains almost entirely unaccounted for in public. Search efforts for Javeayah's remains are continuing at a lower profile than the helicopters and roadblocks that defined the first week, focused on the area of interest outside Aiken County that authorities still haven't named publicly. Sheriff Sawyer said his office has remained in contact with Javeayah's extended family and asked the public to give them room to grieve. A family now holding two realities at once: a granddaughter, a niece, a cousin who is gone, and two of their own who are now the ones facing a courtroom for it. There's no version of this that gives that family something resembling closure soon. A body that hasn't been recovered means a funeral that can't yet happen the way most families are able to have one. A trial that's likely years away means a resolution, whatever shape it eventually takes, that this family will have to live without for a long time. And a newborn baby, born the same night his sister was reported missing, who will grow up into whatever version of this story his family is eventually able to tell him, built on whatever a courtroom ultimately decides is true. That's the part of a case like this that doesn't fit neatly into a headline. The search ends, the news cycle moves on to the next name, but the people closest to it are still living inside all of it, long after the cameras leave Hillsborough Street. Before we close this one out, it's worth remembering how quickly this case moved through stages that usually take true crime cases months or years to reach. A disappearance reported on a Tuesday evening, a multi-agency search with FBI behavioral specialists on the ground within days, a sheriff's announcement, 2 arrests and formal charges, all inside a single week. Speed isn't evidence of anything on its own. Some cases move fast because the evidence is already there to move on. What matters now is what happens next, in a courtroom, with the burden of proof resting exactly where the law requires it to rest. On the prosecution, not on assumption, and not on any of us watching from the outside. What we do know, without needing a verdict to confirm it, is simple, and it doesn't require embellishment. A 4-year-old girl who should have had an entire life ahead of her didn't get one. Whatever the courtroom eventually decides about how and why that happened, that fact isn't going to change. If you have any information related to this case, the Aiken County Sheriff's Office is asking the public to come forward directly. And if this is a case you want us to follow through to its resolution, the charges, the trial, whatever a jury ultimately decides, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we'll be back with an update the moment there's a court date. Before you go, we want to ask you directly, the same way this case has been asking everyone who's followed it. If you lived on that street, watching helicopters pass over a house you'd driven by 100 times without a second thought, would you have seen any of this coming? Let us know what you think happened in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next one.